Hello everyone, this lecture is on Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky, Part 1. Let us start with the note that the author included at the very beginning of this novel. I call it a novel, but as you will discover, the two parts that comprise this text are very different. The second part will read more like a conventional novel because it has a story with multiple characters. The first part, however, is centered on one character who speaks as though he were on stage addressing an audience. In any case, let's look at the note right at the beginning. Quote, "Both the author of the notes and the notes themselves are, of course, fictional. Nevertheless, such persons as the writer of such notes not only may, but even must exist in our society, taking into consideration the circumstances under which our society has generally been formed. I wish to bring before the face of the public, a bit more conspicuously than usual, one of the characters of a time recently past. He is one representative of a generation that is still living out its life. In this fragment entitled Underground, this person introduces himself, his outlook, and seeks to, as it were, to elucidate reasons why he appeared and had to appear among us. In the subsequent fragment will come this person's actual notes about certain events in his life." Unquote. This is signed Fyodor Dostoevsky, so this is definitely the author speaking to the readers. Now, let's consider the formulation. Such persons not only may, but must exist in our society. That must reminds us of the formulation proposed for the Grand Inquisitor found in the Brothers Karamazov. Ivan says to Alyosha that someone like the cardinal, at least one person like him, must have existed. The point was that corrupt the church certainly was, but inside that corrupt institution of God, why can't we imagine at least one person who actually suffered from questions which are fundamental to human existence in God? We must thus confirm a resonance here between the Grand Inquisitor and this man living underground. This novel, Notes from Underground, is earlier than the Brothers Karamazov by about 15 years. Tracing textual resonance is a very literary endeavor, and I encourage everyone to think about how different texts speak to each other or resonate with each other. Back to the author's note, the second part refers to a time recently past, a generation that is still living out its life. What is this historical epoch? The mid-19th century. Put in a broader context we have been following on and off, it is modernity that is at issue. The underground man will prove to be commentary on modernity. Of course, modernity is much longer than just the 19th century, but it is in the 19th century that we begin to really feel the effects of all the modern inventions, intellectual, scientific, technological, which started in the 17th century from the scientific revolution and through the French Revolution, through what we meet in this text as Romanticism. The great wars of the 20th century put to test modern civilization and demonstrated its ills. Indeed, the first chapter of this novel already tells us everything that the narrator thinks concerning modern men. It starts with this very famous line. It's just as famous as Camus' first line in The Stranger. So this line here says, quote, "I am a sick man. I am a wicked man," unquote. These are the first definitions of modern man, and for the rest of the first chapter, this narrator gives us further details on why that is so. Modern man is not only sick and wicked, but refuses to be treated out of that wickedness. He knows that he's sick, he knows that he's wicked, but he refuses to be any other way. Pay attention to the difference, being sick and wicked on the one hand, and being sick and wicked and refusing to be treated out of these qualities on the other. Now let's see how he introduces himself. Quote, "I was a wicked official. I was rude and took pleasure in it. After all, I didn't accept bribes, so I had to reward myself at least with that. A bad witticism, but I won't cross it out. I wrote it thinking it would come out very witty, but now, seeing for myself that I simply had a vile wish to swagger, I purposely won't cross it out. When petitioners would come for information to the desk where I sat, I'd gnash my teeth at them and felt an inexhaustible delight when I managed to upset someone. I almost always managed," unquote. In this short passage, there's already enough of a definition of the underground man. First, he is wicked and rude, and he knows it and enjoys it. But does he enjoy this knowledge? That's a whole other problem that we will have to return to. Secondly, he does not accept bribes, and therefore he needs to get compensated in some other way. Thirdly, note what is between the parentheses. He is reflecting on what he says as he is saying it. He is commenting on his comments on the contemporary times. This doubling is a very important feature, indeed, the single most important feature of this character. He can never make a statement without having thoughts about that statement. Those thoughts would be critical of the statement and additions to the statement or regrets for the statement. In short, he never works at one level of consciousness. There's always another level responding to it. And as far as he's concerned, this is a form of suffering and simultaneously a strange, wicked kind of pleasure. Let's move on. Quote, "The whole thing precisely was, the greatest nastiness precisely lay in my being shamefully conscious every moment, even in moments of the greatest bile, that I was not only not a wicked, but not even an embittered man, that I was simply frightening sparrows in vain and pleasing myself with it. I'm foaming at the mouth, but bring me some little doll, give me some tea with a bit of sugar, and maybe I'll calm down. I'll even wax tender-hearted, though afterwards I'll certainly gnash my teeth at myself and suffer from insomnia for a few months out of shame. Such is my custom," unquote. In the end, his point is that he is shamefully conscious every moment. This means even when he's being wicked, he's never entirely identified with his wickedness. There is that gap between himself acting wickedly and wickedness as a mode of being in the world. Why this gap? Because he watches himself being wicked, and therefore he's never fully wicked. Because in order to be fully wicked, one must forget oneself and simply personify wickedness. But he never achieves that personification of wickedness because he's conscious. This is a cause of shame for him. What is he conscious of? He is conscious of himself. what he's doing and what he is unable to do. Consciousness is always already self-consciousness. So he continues, quote, "As a matter of fact, I was never able to become wicked. I was conscious every moment of so very many elements in myself, absolutely opposite to that. I felt them simply swarming in me, those opposite elements. I knew they had been swarming in me all my life, asking to be let go out of me, but I would not let them. I would purposely would not let them out. That tormented me to the point of shame. They drove me to convulsions, and finally I got sick of them. Oh, how sick I got." Unquote. We can step back and give this another evaluation. He's obviously saying that he is wicked but cannot be entirely wicked even if he wants to. The truth is that when we are conscious of the fact that we are wicked, by definition, it means that consciousness of our wickedness is not the same as wickedness. Otherwise, it would not recognize wickedness as wickedness, because it would be the same as wickedness. You don't recognize something when you are entirely the same as that something. The moment you recognize, the moment you are conscious that you are this or that recognition already signals that there's some part in you that is different from what you supposedly are. In other words, consciousness as self-consciousness marks the position in you that always stands out. So once again, the fact that he knows that he is wicked tells us that he cannot be entirely wicked. Let us continue. Quote, "Not just wicked, no. I never even managed to become anything, neither wicked nor good, neither a scoundrel nor an honest man, neither a hero nor an insect. And now I am living out my life in my corner, taunting myself with the spiteful and utterly futile consolation that it is even impossible for an intelligent man seriously to become anything. And only fools become something. Yes, sir, an intelligent man of the 19th century must be and is morally obliged to be primarily a characterless being, and a man of character, an active figure, primarily a limited being. This is my 40-year-old conviction." Unquote. This really sums up the central argument of the whole text. An intelligent man is conscious and as such lacks character. Why? Because character means that you have particular traits, that you are this or that. But an intelligent man would be conscious of the fact that he is this or that, and as such, not entirely this or that. He cannot identify fully with that trait. People who have character can act precisely because they are not conscious. In other words, they are not divided. They don't always question themselves, and so they can act. But as such, these men of character are also limited. Why? Because they're confined to their traits. They're one with their character and as such closed to difference. This is a broad distinction that the underground man will continue to sustain. That is, distinction between conscious men and active men. We can conjecture that the majority of ordinary people vacillate between the two positions. In that sense, we're dealing with actually three categories of modern man. How does he conclude the chapter? Quote, "But anyhow, what can a decent man speak about with the most pleasure? Answer, about myself," about himself in this case. "So then I too will speak about myself." Unquote. This is important because you have to, by now, recognize the ironic voice. The overall tone of this narrative is ironic. Some readers find it annoying, even offensive, that he never seems serious. But isn't that precisely the point? He can only be ironic because irony means that the speaker is never entirely committed to what he says. I suggest that everyone watch out for this tone. Do not forget that the tone embodies what is said in the text. Now, when he says that a decent man likes to talk about himself, he means all modern men do. In our 21st century, we confirm this every day. What is social media for if not talking about oneself? We might say that we have come to the point of completion of this modern illness of wanting to talk about oneself. The underground man is talking about himself because he is a modern man. But the way he talks about himself is going to be rather different from the way quote-unquote ordinary people talk about themselves, ones who constantly vacillate between consciousness and action. So that difference is what we need to follow. Let me remind you, we know that he was a civil servant when he was 20, and he has been underground at this current location for the last 20 years. And he's now 40 years old and telling us what he has thought about, what conclusions he has been able to draw in these 20 years. In the second part of the novel, we will return to his younger days when he retreated, that was before he retreated underground 20 years ago. In chapter 2, he gives a summary of what we have already talked about. As you might have noticed, there's a lot of repetition, but as long as you remember the central idea which concerns modern consciousness, you will be able to keep yourself from getting lost in this repetition, which is delivered in an ironic tone to make it even harder to follow. At the beginning of chapter 2, he says, quote, "I would like to tell you, gentlemen, whether you do or do not wish to hear it, why I never managed to become even an insect. I'll tell you solemnly that I wanted many times to become an insect, but I was not deemed worthy even of that. I swear to you, gentlemen, that to be overly conscious is a sickness, a real, thorough sickness." Unquote. So he has named it. Consciousness is a sickness. We are now familiar with the nature of consciousness, and so we know that the textual argument is not going to be as simple as this statement. So he continues, quote, "But gentlemen, who can take pride in his sickness and swagger about them besides? Though, what am I saying? Everyone does it. It's their sickness that everyone takes pride in, and I perhaps more than anyone." Unquote. Conscious people suffer from consciousness, but they're also proud precisely of their consciousness. There's no winning in this struggle, or winning is never solely winning because losing is precisely the other side of that winning. So he vacillates, quote, "Let us not argue. My objection was absurd, but all the same, I'm strongly convinced that not only too much consciousness, but even any consciousness at all is a sickness." Unquote. Too much consciousness is what the narrator represents. He's a hyper-conscious man. Normal people, they just live with a degree of consciousness, but they don't suffer so much because they're not hyper-conscious, which also means they have less to be proud of according to this man's logic. At this point, we may recall Meursault of The Stranger, who is a man who seemed to be lacking precisely consciousness. That is just the other side of the very bodily being that he is. He never really reflected on anything, certainly not his own thoughts the way the underground man does. So the underground man continues, quote, "The pleasure here lay precisely in the too vivid consciousness of one's own humiliation. in feeling that one had reached the ultimate wall, that bad as it is, it cannot be otherwise, that there's no way out for you, that you will never change into a different person, unquote. In modern men, humiliation equals pleasure because they share the same source, consciousness. Once you're modern, there's no way out for you. You will never change into a different person, that is, a person without consciousness. Remember, even Meursault at the end of the novel displays consciousness. He reflects and attains a new position in relation to the world. The underground man develops the idea of different levels of consciousness in reference to people who can take revenge as opposed to people who cannot. At the beginning of chapter 3, he says, quote, "What happens, for example, if people who know how to take revenge and generally how to stand up for themselves, once they are overcome, say by vengeful feeling, then for the time, there is simply nothing left in their whole being but this feeling. Such a gentleman just lunges straight for his goal like an enraged bull, horns lowered, and maybe only a wall can stop him," unquote. The idea of nothing left in their whole being but this feeling is what I earlier meant by full identification between the person and that particular trait. Being fully that thing that you are. If you are happy, you are nothing but that happiness. If you are unhappy, you are nothing but that unhappiness. You no longer have the trait. You no longer have the trait, but you are it. The man continues, quote, "Well, sirs, it is just such an ingenuous man that I regard as the real, normal man, the way his tender Mother Nature herself wished to see him when she so kindly conceived him on the earth. I envy such a man to the point of extreme bile. He is stupid, I won't argue with you about that, but perhaps a normal man ought to be stupid. How do you know? Perhaps it's even very beautiful," unquote. What he means by the real normal man is not what I referred to as ordinary or normal man earlier. What he means is the rare kind of men who inhabit their bodies as opposed to the majority of moderns who live in their consciousness in the main. Or the other rarity, those like the underground men who live solely in their consciousness. Crucially, he's not saying that such a man who lives in body is a hero to look up to. Such a man is stupid, he says. Stupid in the sense that he has no power of thinking, no power of reflection. So the underground man envies such men, but does not necessarily hold them in esteem. Once again, consider Meursault, who seems so innocent, but also deficient in the qualities that we expect from a well-developed man. Not necessarily in the area of conventions, but the power of reflection, charting one's own destiny. This ambiguity is the difficulty of this text. The man continues, quote, "One takes the antithesis of the normal man, that is, the man of heightened consciousness, who came, of course, not from the bosom of nature, but from a retort." This is almost mysticism, gentlemen, but I suspect that too. This retort man sometimes falls before his antithesis so far that he honestly regards himself with all his heightened consciousness as a mouse and not a man. A highly conscious mouse, perhaps, but a mouse all the same. Whereas here we have a man, and consequently, and so on and so on. And above all, it is he himself who regards himself as a mouse. No one asks him to, and that is an important point. Unquote. Now we come to the extreme opposite of what he calls normal men, who, as we have defined, lives in his body. This man of heightened consciousness regards himself as a mouse. This is, of course, connected to the other term that he used before, shame. He's always ashamed of himself because he's nothing but a mouse. We already know why he feels that way. He feels that way because he can never be anything, nor can he change into a different kind of person. The fact that he cannot change himself does not make him resign himself to his fate either. He goes on feeling inadequate no matter what he does. He permanently suffers from this impossible position. He's always anxious, easily offended, ever doubtful. He's contemptuous and at the same time ashamed. All of these opposite feelings harass him all the time. The third kind of men are the people who he is addressing, saying gentlemen. They represent ordinary people. Note how they react to the men. Granted, all this is the man's imagination, he doesn't actually have an audience. Yet, this crowd seems a pretty accurate representation of ordinary people. In fact, many students often react to the underground men the same way as this imaginary audience. They sneer at the narrator. They all but retort to the man, "Oh, you are saying all this because you're frustrated in your life, yet you do nothing, so it's all your fault." These gentlemen, the anonymous crowd, represent the norms of modernity. And they represent what the man calls the laws of nature, science, and mathematics. These very reasonable gentlemen would say, quote, "You can rebel. It's 2 times 2 is 4, unquote. Why don't you just accept things as they are? Then you don't have to torture yourself, then in turn make other people suffer because of your unhappiness. You make other people suffer too." This is the kind of thing that the audience would say to him. But the underground man's point is, yes, that may be true, but somehow man is built in such a way that he cannot be reconciled with this given reality where rebellion is just out of the question. That is the impossible logic here. You cannot rebel, and yet you cannot not rebel. In the same chapter 3, the man continues, quote, "As if such a stone wall were truly soothing and truly contained in itself at least some word on the world, solely by being 2 times 2 is 4. Oh, absurdity of absurdities! Quite another thing is to understand all, to be conscious of all impossibilities and stone walls, not to be reconciled with a single one of these impossibilities and stone walls if you are loath to be reconciled, to reach by way of the most inevitable logical combinations, the most revolting conclusions on the eternal theme that you yourself seem somehow to blame even for the stone wall," unquote. The given reality as such is already absurd. On top of that, man is made in such a way that he cannot be reconciled with it. The tricky thing is that many people try to live in reconciliation with this absurdity of absurdities and do succeed in stifling the discontents rising from consciousness. These reconciled people may have it easier, but that does not mean that they are necessarily spared suffering. On the other hand, those who understand all, are conscious of all, and are not reconciled, have the happiness of Sisyphus, so to speak, which is, according to Camus, the only happiness actually available to men. Reconciled people may suffer less, but also enjoy less. We may conclude between these two arguments. On the one hand, the more uncertain you are, the more it hurts. On the other hand, that is the human experience par excellence, and as such, the more is there to derive from life. Nothing is going to become certain except the fact that nothing is going to change. That is the only thing that is certain and one can become more certain of. It is in chapter 7 that a new discourse begins. This is where he introduces the second key concept, namely desire. We began with the first key concept, that was consciousness, and now we are at desire. This new concept helps the narrator further define men of heightened consciousness. To the extent that these men of heightened consciousness still desire, they are the ones who sustain what defines humanity. What is humanity? What makes men men? What makes men human? The fact that he cannot be completely calculated. Calculations, scientific calculations of all kinds, have defined modernity. But what the underground man argues is that men do not follow these calculations. So why do we act as if we could teach people how to behave? Let us look at the text. Quote, "Oh, tell me who first announced, who was the first to proclaim that man does dirty only because he doesn't know his real interests, and that were he to be enlightened, were his eyes to be opened to his real, normal interests, man would immediately become good and noble because being enlightened and understanding his real profit, he would see his real profit precisely in the good, and it's common knowledge that no man can act knowingly against his own profit. Consequently, out of necessity, so to speak, he would start doing good." Unquote. So who first proposed this idea that it's only a matter of people understanding what's good for them, then they will do it? This is an instance of science meeting utilitarianism. We have never seen this manifesting in actual reality. Even when we seem to be very close to realizing this ideal, we never fully embody it, body and soul, so to speak. This is another way of saying that we are conscious, therefore we are divided. When we know for sure that a certain thing is good for us, we're never without some dissenting voice somewhere that disturbs that certainty. That is what makes humans human, or this is at least the narrator's argument. Let us look at another articulation of the same idea. Quote, "And will you take it upon yourself to define with perfect exactitude precisely what man's profit consists in? And what if it so happens that on occasion man's profit not only may but precisely must consist in sometimes wishing what is bad for himself and not what is profitable?" Unquote. We all have this experience. People who are older and wiser than ourselves would tell us to reconsider our choices, and we even agree with them, and yet we go on to do exactly what they advised us against. This is what the narrator means by our desires, which cannot be calculated. Calculation that is based on apparently obvious profits or benefits. Quote, "Well, but it is a profit after all. You will interrupt me. I beg your pardon, sirs, but we shall speak further of it. And the point is not in a play on words, but in the fact that this profit is remarkable precisely because it destroys all our classifications and constantly shatters all the systems elaborated by lovers of mankind for the happiness of mankind." Unquote. As said earlier, this is a convergence of science and utilitarianism. They classify and calculate reality and impose what we call norms and standards, straying from which brands one irrational, therefore abnormal. Yet, our desire works in such a way that it always manages to take these calculations and classifications by surprise. We see evidence in the way in which human civilization has evolved, especially modernity. Thanks to reason and science, we have gained so much knowledge, and yet reality hasn't reflected it, only in profits. Quote, "Formerly, man, saw justice in bloodshed and with a quiet conscience exterminated whoever he had to. While now, though, we do regard bloodshed as vile, and we still occupy ourselves with this vileness, and even more than formerly." Unquote. Men of the past used violence when they needed to, and they had no concept of violence being bad. Men of today don't stop reflecting on the ills of violence, but does that make them any less violent? No. In fact, modern men practice even more violence, feeling bad about it all the time, yet unable to stop. The narrator's conclusion is, quote, "that man, whoever he might be, he has always and everywhere liked to act as he wants, not at all as reason and profit. And one sometimes even positively must, this is my own idea now, one's own free and voluntary wanting, one's own caprice, however wild, one's own fancy, though chaffed sometimes to the point of madness. All this is that same most profitable profit, the omitted one, which does not fit into any classification, and because of which all systems and theories are constantly blown to the devil." Unquote. And the final sentence here is important. "Man needs only independent wanting." In short, desiring man is not in any way easier position. If anything, he suffers more because of it. But that's what makes him human. These are the reflections that our anti-hero has collected while living underground for 20 years. Part 2 of the novel will tell us what happened in his life to make him retreat underground. This concludes our lecture today. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.